Well, Mark, I think it's time for us to talk a little bit about sharing about leaders and how we select and invite good leaders to be able to be part of it. You and I both know that leaders are just absolutely critical in what we're doing. I remember when I was a young member of a stake presidency years ago back in the Washington, D.C. area, I was riding with Elder J. Richard Clark, who was our conference visitor, and he was just talking. And this is a man who is one of the finest leaders in the church. And I actually have my J. Richard Clark file that I pull out every time I get a new assignment. But he said something. He says, when I was the head of the office there in Boise for Mutual of New York, he said, my boss in New York said, Dick, he said, if your numbers go down, you won't hear from me. That's something that you need to do. You'll deal with that. But if I ever hear that you're hiring substandard agents, I will be on your doorstep in a heartbeat. He says, I learned that it was important to hire good people. And so that's what we're going to be talking about now. About the basic purposes of this session is to help us to identify the quality of scouting leaders that we're really looking for, and also to be able to find the places where you find good leaders. Where do you find some of these leaders? And some of them are obvious and some of them are not so obvious. And then thirdly, the importance of training of good leaders. So before we flip onto this next screen, if you could go on to your chat screen, and let's ask you a few things, and that is, give us some ideas of where or what the characteristics would be of your leaders, of some good leaders. For some reason, I'm not showing them on my machine here. I'm not showing a chat screen here.
Yeah, let's see.
Okay, so you're going to have to watch those, Mark.
Got it. I've got him, Charles.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Charles, when you're in showing mode, sharing your screen mode, there's the dot on the far right. If you hit that, right below that is the chat window.
It just says chat record. Oh, maybe that's it.
Yep, hit chat right there. And
okay, there we go. There we go. Mark, do you want to mention some of those that are coming up?
Yeah, I do. And why I'm getting my hands onto this to the right screen, I just have to mention, we have some of our great friends of other faiths that are involved with our conference today. So thank you all. I've noticed you making some comments in our chat feature as well. People are saying that they're looking for leaders that are empathetic, that are dependable, that can follow the Scout oath and law, selfless, servant leaders, well-trained, patient, know how to mentor and coach, have integrity, they're creative. They love the youth, motivational, kind, determined, creative, passionate, consistent.
I love a boys man.
Yeah.
By Baden Powell. That's a great one.
The list goes on and on, Charles.
It does go on and on. Let's look at the list that you and I looked at a little bit. And is that coming up? I'm not getting it coming up for some reason.
It's on the screen, Charles.
Okay. Okay, great. Is it on the screen now?
Yes.
Okay. High moral and ethical standards, living the Scout oath and Scout law. Mark, you want to comment on a couple of these?
Yeah, I do, Charles. I want to talk for a moment about organizational skills. It's critical that you surround yourself with people who have maybe some of the skills that you don't personally have. Go out there, find people that are the very best at that. I have a personal example of that. There's a gentleman that in my own neighborhood that he's become a very good friend of mine. And this guy is so organized. On a very personal note, he told me that he had 23 cases of toilet paper when COVID-19 hit. You know, I mean, this guy, he was always a step ahead of everybody. Well,
he must trust you.
Yeah. But the point is, he was organized, and he was actually assigned as our unit commissioner because the district saw his value and his skill.
That's great.
So organizational skills is great. Another one is a good communicator. One of my assistant scoutmaster, as many of you know, I've been serving as a scoutmaster for the last year and a half with our own unit. And one of my assistant scoutmasters is a master at communication. And I knew that before we started. And so shortly after we started, I said to him, I said, Eric, I have a task for you. I need you to send out an email every single week on Mondays so that the moms and dads know exactly what we're doing. And he's done that faithfully now for a year and a half. And everybody just knows that Eric's going to send them an email and they're going to know exactly what's happening in the troop. So can't emphasize communication enough.
That's great. And we've got some of these others. I think on our chat line, we've covered most of those characteristics of quality scouting leaders. So let's look at, and every youth deserves a trained leader, somebody who's interested in training. Let's look at where you find quality leaders. Mark, do you want to touch base on some of these?
Yes, Charles, thank you. You don't have to look too far, friends. You just need to make an effort at it. And we've provided a list here of some of our ideas, and we have others, and I'll touch on one of those here in a second. But of course, Wood Badge, lists of Eagle Scouts, list of Silver Beavers, those who are currently serving in scouting. Look at the leadership of the various charter organizations. And of course, outdoor and sporting goods stores. Another idea that came to me, as you know, I'm now serving in Japan. My council serves 40 countries in the Orient, and it is so exciting to interact with all these people. And as you can imagine, we don't have the opportunity to get together face to face very often, but we do have a lot of meetings on Zoom and GoToMeeting and other platforms. Well, one of my volunteers in Shanghai, China, he's a great cub master. His name is Dan. Several years ago, he started to develop a list of Eagle Scouts that live in Asia. And I asked him, I said, Dan, how do you collect their names? I mean, you're talking about billions of people who live in this part of the world. And he said, Mark, it's simple. He said, I just organized a feature on LinkedIn. And I don't understand the technology. I'll ask Dan and I'll provide some more information to everybody. But what it does is LinkedIn searches everybody's information, and anybody who lists that they're in Asia and that they're an Eagle Scout, all of a sudden he gets a message. So he's been able to develop this list, and he's identified some great individuals, even in Shanghai alone, that have now come and stepped up and are volunteering with him in his unit. They don't have any children in scouting. In some cases, they're not even married. But because of the use of technology, he was able to identify those. So that's another great idea in terms of how we can identify great leadership.
Right. You know, it's interesting, but I was talking with Mike Serbaugh a little while ago, and Mike had mentioned that his father was not involved when he was a young scout. His mother was a den leader, and then Mike got excited about scouting and started going through scouting. He says, until about 15, my dad really wasn't involved. But then he drove us to a camp out, and actually started liking the association of those other adults that were involved in there, the other men that were there. And he said all of a sudden he became more involved and more involved. He ended up going to Wood Badge, served on a number of Wood Badge staffs, and was involved for the rest of my scouting career. He says, my younger brother was 10 years younger than I was. And so he was involved in practically his whole scouting career. But, you know, sometimes we miss those who just come for a moment. It's an opportunity to grab onto them for one reason, and that is they've already felt the scouting spirit, which is an important part of what we're doing here. So once you found somebody to serve, it's important to figure out, you know, the close, and that is, what do we do? And we got just a couple of guidelines that might be helpful. And Mark, why don't you go through this if you would, and then I'm going to talk about the specific invitation.
I'd be happy to, Charles, but I just remembered there's one more volunteer I want to mention.
Yeah.
And that's a member of my stake presidency. And I know I'm treading on some sacred ground here, but I want to try to be very clear on how this dynamic works. I had the opportunity about 19 or 20 months ago to go to lunch with a good friend, happens to be a member of the stake presidency. We had a great lunch. We didn't even talk about scouting. We just talked about the stuff we're interested in. And at the end of the conversation, he looked at me and he said, Mark, I understand the church is going to separate ties with scouting. He said, would it be possible for my business to start a unit? I was shocked to think that he would present that idea to me. And of course, in my mind, I was thinking, boy, that's really going to be tricky because you're a member of the stake presidency. But over the course of the next several weeks, he and I talked through all the details, all the dynamics. And I have to tell you, it's worked out really well.
It's worked out great. I know I've been out to your stake and been out to some courts of honor and some other things, and he is really engaged.
He is, and he's careful. He's very careful of which hat he's wearing, and he doesn't use his priesthood church responsibility to coerce or pressure anybody to be involved in scouting.
Right.
But I'll tell you,
he's there because he loves it, and it's kind of like a dad.
He is, and he comes to our meetings. He comes to the committee meetings, comes to the PAC meetings, the troop meetings, courts of honor, whatever he's available to come to. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you. So don't overlook those great priesthood leaders and other female leaders that you associate with in the church. Okay, thank you for letting me share that, Charles.
You're welcome. So Mark, let's assume that you've got 2 or 3 candidates. How do you figure out how to take the next step?
Yeah, so if you look here at the slide here, we just have to recognize that, well, the first point, let's be prayerful about this. Prayer is not something exclusive to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As we all know, the first point of the Scout oath is to do our duty to God, and the final point of the Scout law is to be reverent. So let's be prayerful as we identify these leaders.
You mean to tell me that we can be prayerful about things that don't have anything to do with the church?
We can, Charles. Yes, that's wonderful.
Of course we can.
Remember that.
Yeah, we pray, like you said the other day when you and I were chatting, we pray over our flocks and our herds. And I remember one night actually in this community years ago when I was living in Salt Lake in the middle of a trial, and it was the night before closing arguments, and I sat around looking at all of these exhibits in my hotel room, and there was just something missing. And I remember getting down on my knees and saying, just help me to understand. And as I pondered there and sat there in that room quietly, all of a sudden the feelings came that put this whole thing together. And it will help us because we're in the business, and I use the business in a deeper sense, but we're in the work of helping to save the souls of these young men and young women and to help strengthen them and to help them to be prepared for life. And I really believe that a kind Heavenly Father has an interest in that. So prayer is certainly appropriate.
Yeah. And a great dovetail, Charles, to this next point about helping them to feel the spirit of scouting. I have felt a strong spirit of scouting today. I know in our church we describe it a little differently, but in scouting we call it the spirit of scouting. Charles is famous for singing that song. I've got that scouting spirit all over me. And I've been in many settings where Charles gets the entire audience, even if it's several hundred people. And if there's some people not singing, then he calls them out and he says, let's all sing this together. There is a special spirit that exists in scouting, and it's similar to what Charles just said. I believe that God wants this program to succeed. I know that he wants our young people to succeed. But as we select these leaders, we've got to help them to feel that. We have got to help, we've got to create opportunities. Maybe it's around a campfire or at a den meeting or a PAC meeting, where these new leaders that we're trying to recruit and invite to help us, we need to help them to feel that. And if they'll feel that, then there's a much greater likelihood that they'll accept the invitation to serve. Charles, do you want to take the next point?
Yeah, that'd be great. When you're meeting with them after you've received a confirmation that this is the right one, consider the appropriate time and location. It's important that you be at a place where you can be undisturbed and when you can really chat and have a discussion. And I've always felt like it's important to lay it out on the line. We talk an awful lot, in some ways jokingly, about sugarcoating a calling, but that happens a lot, but it shouldn't. An individual ought to know at least somewhat about what they're getting into in a calling. And I found that as a stake president and as a young single adult branch president, it was helpful for me to have a guide when I was issuing a call. And so I had a sheet of paper that I had that I would give to the individual as I was issuing a call. As a young single adult branch president, if I was issuing a call to a Relief Society president, I'd bring her in, I'd talk to her about worthiness, make sure she was worthy of the calling, and then I would say, I'm here on the Lord's errand to issue a call to you to serve as the Relief Society president. And then I'd say, before you answer, let me just share this sheet with you, and let's go through this so you'll understand what the responsibilities and the time constraints are. Now, you don't want to use those first two because in a way, this is an inspired program, but I would certainly say that we have considered very carefully and prayerfully the assignment of the Scoutmaster. And then I would give them a sheet, and this sheet would include a number of things on it. And the sheet that I gave each of the individuals in our ward when I issued a church calling was the same guidelines as I gave for a Scoutmaster. And that is, number one, a clear and understanding definition of the scouting assignment. What is it that you want me to do? And one of the things is not just be Scoutmaster, but I want you to be prepared for the troop meeting on Tuesday of this week, or maybe a week after that. Because this week I want you to take youth protection training, and I want you to start your online training and be able to figure out what that is. But in 10 days, I want you to be able to be prepared to have a successful troop meeting. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is what the time commitment is and exact times of the meetings. By the way, it's nice to have the spouse in this meeting, because it will be important for the spouse also to feel the spirit of scouting, as Mark talked about, and what the responsibilities are. What are the performance expectations? And here you might talk about Journey to Excellence, JTE. Sometimes we have troops that go years and years without ever looking at what has been identified as the markers for a quality troop, and for a troop that is really impacting the lives of the young men and the young women that they serve. And that's why you have this JTE scorecard for packs and dens and troops and ships and crews, posts. So I would go through that. Then what resources are available? What materials are there? What is online? And I might even, sometimes on an evaluation, I'll have a screen right there, and I'll go right on to the online resources, let them know what's there. I might have a copy of a manual there if it's a Scoutmaster, to give him a copy of a scout, the current scouting handbook. And I may have written a note in it telling him how much I appreciate his willingness to be involved. Or if I'm asking a woman to be able to be the committee chair, I'm going to be able to put that in there and give some things that are right in her hand. The training expectations. I want each of them to know, if they're not already trained, that they will need to take youth protection training. Unless it's late at night, I would say, I want you to go home tonight and take the youth protection training online. Because it is extremely important for you to understand that safety is absolutely critical in everything we do. Not only safety from sexual abuse or emotional abuse, but safety from physical danger. And that is, if your boys want to go down the river and you can't afford it, and so you're going to do it in a cheap way because you've got a couple of guys who have been down the river before, forget it. Don't even think about it. Wait, be able to get it so you can get some experienced guides until you can afford it, and then go down in a right way. If you're going to go rappelling, go someplace where they have certified rappelling experts. There's nothing that damages an event or a young man's life than having a companion who has died in an event. We just want to make sure that these activities are safe. I'll also want them to go online and begin their training there. I'll also want them to put on their calendar a wood badge date, and I'll have a copy of when the wood badge courses are in that particular council, so that they will know when they are, whether they're week courses or weekend courses, and that's my expectation. Then I want that individual to know the person to whom he or she reports, because it's important for them to be able to give a report now and then, and to be able to have somebody ask, how are you doing? You know, it's amazing, but a Scoutmaster can go years and years and years without anybody ever saying, how are you doing? Where do you feel most uncovered? Now, you ask who's the most ideal individual to ask that question? Well, from my standpoint, there are two individuals. One ought to be asking it on a regular basis. The other ought to be asking it actually on a fairly regular basis as well. One is the committee chair. The committee chair is the one who, with that committee, is the one who selects and appoints the scoutmaster, and or the den leader, or the cub master, or whatever the assignment is. And they're the ones who ought to be checking and saying, how can I help? Where do you feel most uncovered? Where do you feel the weakest? And how can we help you? But the other is a commissioner. And we're going to talk about commissioners a little later this afternoon. Mark, did you have something to add there?
No, I just said amen, Charles.
Oh, good. I always like a good amen. Okay, and then the last item is an expression of love and support. And it's important to be able for you to say, I have all the confidence in you in the world. And if I can be helpful, let me know. I'm not here to meddle. I am going to visit periodically because I want you to know that I support you. And when I'm there, I'm not there to pry or to meddle or do anything else other than just be there to feel the strength of this great program. So, Mark, one of the challenges that we've got is the importance of training. What can you share with us about the importance of training? Because it's an important part of our leaders, and actually it's an important part of retaining leaders.
It's not only important, Charles, but it's also fun. There's a lot of wonderful aspects to training. I want to start out this portion by sharing my quick story, and then I've got a youth protection story.
Good.
Here as well. I didn't understand the importance of training until I had my first assignment as a scout leader, as a varsity scout coach. I don't even think I've even told any of you this story before. But it was, boy, it's been a lot of years ago. And I remember we did like a one evening in a building, and then we had to go to a weekend camp out to learn about the nuts and bolts. And I remember when I was on that weekend camp out, that's where I had my aha moment. This is probably 25, maybe 30 years ago when I had this experience. And it was on that overnight camp out when I was in a tent, in a sleeping bag that night, and then standing around the campfire and listening to all these other leaders that were twice my age, most of which were old enough to be my father, and some of which were old enough to be my grandfather. And I sat there thinking, wow, this is so inspiring. I want to be that kind of leader. So obviously I've spent the rest of my life becoming trained so that I can train others on how to make this scouting journey work. And it's really been a blessing. That for me, that was a turning point.
That is great.
But let me talk about youth protection. This is the first point on the slide there. I can't emphasize this enough, and that Boy Scouts of America require this. Nobody can join our program as an adult anymore until they have completed youth protection. And I want to emphasize this with this following story. It makes me tear up thinking about it. I wish when I was a boy that I understood the importance of youth protection training, because I didn't. And it wasn't until I was on my mission when I got a letter from my parents, and they said, Mark, were you ever abused when you were a scout? I had no idea what they were talking about. Of course, I wrote them a letter back in the days of writing letters. And I said, Mom and Dad, I have no idea what you're saying or what this is in reference to, but no, I was never abused when I was a scout. And that's all. That was the entire conversation. And it wasn't until I came home from my mission that they disclosed to me what had happened. And what happened was one of my scout leaders abused a number of the scouts in my troop. During all the same time I was involved. And I don't ever, ever, ever want that to happen again to any scout. Those were my friends that were abused. And I don't want to see that happen again. So I am a solid proponent of youth protection training, and we have to preach this time and time again. Not only do we have to preach the importance of people completing their youth protection training, but we as adult leaders have to ensure that we follow the BSA's youth protection guidelines. And if we do, we will ensure that we have a safe program for our youth and our young people to be part of.
That's really important. Great.
So with that, you want to take the next one, Charles? I think you
Actually,
have a story about this
actually,
one.
let me just share an experience I had. I kind of started in my adult scouting a little upside down. I was back in the Washington, D.C. area and was called to a stake young men presidency. And so I was put in as the responsibility for back then, the ventures, which was the teacher age boys. And so I thought, well, okay. So I got involved and went to all of the district meetings and everything. And then I was put into a stake presidency and kind of oversaw scouting for that. When we moved back to Utah several years later, I felt, I kind of started backwards. And I'd never been to basic training. And I was called initially as the scoutmaster, and they had no committee. So I said to the member of the bishopric, is it okay with you if I also serve as a member of the committee initially, and then we'll work to get that committee? He says, okay. I wanted a little control, but I thought, I just really need to go to basic training. So I went to basic training. And the very first session, that's when in basic training, you went for six nights and then an overnighter. And spaced out over about a 6-7 week period. And one of the first things that they taught us is go down to the store, back then Kmart, and get a lawn chair. And I said to the guy, why do you get a lawn chair? He says, it's the last thing you put in your car when you pack. And when you get to your camp, it's the first thing that you bring out. And it's the first thing that you put down, and then you sit in it. Because it reminds you that you are the advisor and the boys are the ones that are doing things. And so I went right down to Kmart and I bought 2 lawn chairs. And on our next camp out, I pulled out those 2 lawn chairs and I put one down and I put the other one right next to it. And that's where my senior patrol leader would come. I would sit there, they'd unload the car, they'd do everything. He'd come and sit to me and say, how are we doing? We doing everything? Any other directions? I'd talk to him about it, and he would go off and make sure that everything got happened. So just that one thing helped me to understand that this is a boy-led program. And so many times I've been in quorum meetings on Sunday where a young man is just sharp as can be, goes around, shakes hands with all of the quorum members. And then in the middle of his introduction, one of the boys says, so what are we doing on Wednesday, which is Scouts? And his comment, he looks over his advisor and said, so what are we doing on Wednesday? And his advisor, in almost every case, would say, well, we'll talk about that later, which means that's in 3 days. And I haven't thought about it yet, but I'll get an answer to you, which is just the opposite of, they've overlooked what Gary taught us about annual plans. They've overlooked the importance that we've heard throughout this entire day and last night about the importance of boy and girl-led programs where they're developing leadership skills. And so it's really important that we learn those things as part of this training. And I just can't emphasize the importance of that number 4, and that is Wood Badge. When I went to Wood Badge, I'd been a scoutmaster for a little while, and not very long, actually, about 6 months. And I may never, at least until the last few years when I got back on Wood Badge courses, but I may never have been able to tie a woggle in my life if my life depended on it. But I will never forget the feeling that I had that last evening around the campfire at our Wood Badge. That was the aha experience for me. And it was life-changing. And so I just encourage, if you haven't been to all of these training, we've got enough Latter-day Saints who have not been through the training across the country that we could double or triple the number of Wood Badge courses that we're having. And we really ought to. We really ought to get involved in that. It's a wonderful opportunity. I had a counselor that once said, he was a management consultant. He said, I've been to management training that costs $15,000 and more. And he said, you don't get any better leadership training than you get at a Wood Badge course. And so I just encourage you to get involved in training and also make sure that your leaders are involved in training. Now, our next opportunity is to be able to take your questions. And so if you would go on the Q&A cycle, and I'll see if I can bring it up here.
Amy can help us as well.
Oh, Amy, that's right. Amy, tell me what questions you have for us.
Hello. Okay. Sure. I'm under the Q&A right now. None of them are specific for your topic, for your session. There are several questions that are accumulating, but unless they've been fed through the chat, I don't have them on the Q&A.
One thing on the chat, Amy, if I could interject real quick, a lot of people are talking about Roundtable.
Yeah.
I've always been a strong proponent of Roundtable, but most of my time has been in a location where it's easy for people to drive to a building for Roundtable. But now that I'm kind of refocusing my energy on the Asia, I'm realizing that, you know what, we don't have that option, period, end of statement. So we have some of the world's finest virtual roundtables that I've been part of in the last month and a half. So I just share that little nugget with you, but I want to emphasize the importance of Roundtable. Roundtables are a great opportunity to interact with others, to rub shoulders with great leaders who have a lot of experience. Don't be intimidated when you go to Roundtable. Don't think, it's hard to go there because I don't know very much about this. Flip that around and go to Roundtable with lots of questions in your mind and ask them and learn as much as you can from all the leaders around you.
You know, I've always said that, in fact, I remember Sydney Reynolds ask a question when we were in Denver together training. She says, how many of you have been to a boring roundtable? Everybody raised their hand. She said, if you've been to a boring roundtable, I encourage you to go again. And as I sat there listening to her, it was my turn to speak next. And I got up and I said, I just loved what Sister Reynolds said, but I don't think it's enough. I agree with her that if you've been to a boring roundtable, go again. But if it's still boring, offer to help. Because that individual has probably been in their slot for 5, 10, 15 years. They've run out of ideas. President Oaks, when he was at BYU, said, you know, you can only serve in a responsibility for about 5 to 7 years, and then you run out of ideas, and it's time for somebody else to get on there and get involved in that. And so I think that's important for us to be able to do that. The question was, do you think that there's a problem as Latter-day Saints? We're so used to being called that we kind of wait, you know. It's like President Clark said, we neither seek after a call nor do we turn one down. And maybe that's so ingrained in our minds that we don't realize that with regard to community involvement, we don't have to wait to be called. You know, we ought to seek out opportunities to make a difference. Do you think that's a problem, Mark?
No, I don't think it's a problem, Charles. In fact, I think it's a great idea. I saw that coming through the chat earlier today. But my recommendation would be there is a process in scouting. You don't just show up in a meeting and say, hey, I want to be the scoutmaster. Get to know the committee chairman, the PAC committee chairman, the troop committee chairman, the crew committee chairman, and other key leaders in our other youth programs. Get to know the right people, and then let them know of your interest. And that you have the time and capacity and that you want to serve, and be specific. Say, I would like to serve in this capacity if the opportunity presents itself.
Yeah. I've got a note here that says, as a unit commissioner, I was once asked to address a combined meeting of a ward whose scout units were really struggling. One of the first things I asked was how many have been served in scouting before? Lots of hands went up. What was their experience like? They loved it, had lots of fun with the youth. And then the question, why did they stop? They were released. It was a revelation for most of them to hear that they needn't be called to serve in a scout unit, even in the former church structure. There are lots of room for volunteers. And we know that, whether it's as a merit badge counselor or just driving the youth back and forth. And, you know, with young women in the program now, this is a wonderful opportunity for us to build both our young women and our young men, and to do that in a parallel way as the church works on their development as well. So.
I think Amy had some questions for us.
Yeah,
Yes,
I have
Amy?
one question. Yeah. It's regarding introduction to outdoor leadership skills for those folks that are volunteering. as Scoutmaster, Assistant Scoutmaster, or another position in Scouts BSA, if their council doesn't have a upcoming course, what can they do? I mean, that's supposed to be an in-person course.
Is that the outdoor course?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Mark, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. Amy, correct me if I'm wrong, Amy, but I believe that if somebody has the skills already in outdoor leadership skills, there's a way that they can kind of test out of it. As long as they have somebody in their district that they can review all of their skills with, then they can get credit for it. I'm not sure, Amy, is that appropriate?
You know, I think it goes back to where it was a training before Introduction to Outdoor Leadership Skills, where they could kind of be grandfathered in.
Okay.
But I don't know if that's actually written anywhere. That might be something we follow up with.
Okay, so that's something that you need to check with your district or your council
Mm-hmm.
training chairs, and they'll give you guidance on that.
You know, another thing you might think about is I know that some councils are really large, and this doesn't make sense with being spread out, but it's not uncommon for us to have an individual in a wood badge course who was not able to go to a wood badge course in their council, and so they came to ours. And when I went to my wood badge course directors conference, I was not able to work into my schedule any of the training, as many as there were in our councils in Utah, and I ended up going up to Tacoma, Washington. And so, you know, the courses are standard across the board. And Amy and Mark, is there any problem with doing that from a BSA standpoint?
Oh, no, absolutely not.
So
Definitely.
they really ought to look at that. You know, sometimes only a border separates a council, and you might actually be closer to a neighboring council than you are to the headquarters of your own council. And so where training is there, I would say, in fact, one of our most active wood badge participants up in Salt Lake when we had it at the Thomas S. Monson Lodge there at the Hinckley Scout Ranch was a member of a stake presidency down here in St. George. He came all the way each weekend, came up all the way up there, and we had a number from outside. So,
yeah, let me emphasize something to our audience. BSA takes training very seriously, and they invest a lot of resources into our quality of training. We actually have something that's called Scouting U, and they have a board of trustees, and these people are passionate about our curriculum, and they do not want us to water down any of our training. They don't want us to take any shortcuts. But in these kind of situations where sometimes things simply aren't available to us, just work with your district training chair, your council training chair, and find solutions. I know that in my new council in the Far East, we have to come up with some creative solutions because of distance. But that's not, individuals don't make those decisions. Those are council decisions under the direction of the council training committee.
you know, I don't know whether Alejandro Yandro is still with us from Argentina, but when I was in Argentina, and we were looking at potential relationship there, they said, well, you'll have to make sure that all your leaders were trained. And I said, well, what about a gear up time as far as this? They said, no. We've already had a couple of lawsuits that have taught us that training is absolutely critical. We will come in and make sure that your troops are covered until your leaders are fully trained, which meant wood badge trained. And they called it, when they received their 2 beads, it was dos tacos. And I remember this, and they were serious about training, and we need to be serious about training as well. And so we've got another one here, and that is Vanguard, this is kind of back on a Vanguard one, but the question was, is Vanguard going to have any awards for individuals? And they use the term of Trevor Bender, whoever Trevor Bender is, who is one of the scouts of this individual, and said he's one of the great prides of my scouting career. Is Vanguard going to get involved in any awards recognizing his efforts?
You're looking at me, Charles. I don't know.
Well, I think the issue is, at least now we're not, because we're here to support the scouting unit. Vanguard does not charter units. And there are enough recognition awards for the Trevor Benders and all of the others that are across the movement that are already there in scouting to be able to recognize them. So I think for now, not in the future, maybe. So, Amy, any other questions?
Yeah, someone else asked to talk a little bit more, or just hit some more points on succession planning for scout leaders.
You know, I had a partner years ago, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in the commissioner session. But I had a partner years ago who was a wonderful lawyer. Those of you in Utah would recognize his name, but he left our firm, and there was no succession planning. There was nobody to take over his position. And and as a result, we lost a lot of effort and a lot of business. And I have found that one of the most important things that, in fact, let me go back. When a chief scout executive was hired recently, the very first thing that Rex Tillerson said to him is, make sure that you understand that your first responsibility is succession planning. And that is to make sure that there is young strength coming up and being trained in an appropriate way to take over your responsibility and everybody else's in the system, because that's important wherever we are. I've always found that it's important for every leader to make sure that if he or she walks out of the office, gets hit by a truck, they'll have a funeral, everybody a week, but the next day it'll be business as usual because there's somebody else that's there. And so I think that it's very important to make sure that we have depth in our units and that you have assistant scoutmasters and that you have other committee members that are there, not just as bodies, but you're always asking yourself, who's the next one to be able to take over there? Because even though we talk about tenure, and tenure is important, and I love to see scoutmasters that have gone that long, we realize that all of us in time are subject to burnout. And that is, you serve so long in a responsibility, and there's going to be burnout that comes in. And for that reason, there better be an opportunity for you, if you're the scoutmaster, to move into another responsibility, maybe as a commissioner, and to have somebody else who's been trained and mentored and ready to move into that position in 5-7 years, whatever it is. You don't have to get out of scouting there, but it's wonderful to be able to have somebody that's there. So depth is important. Mark, do you have any other thoughts on that?
No, I just have my own personal example. I knew that I wouldn't be here long in my role as scoutmaster for the troop and committee chairman for the pack. So I always had my eye on who was going to replace me. And of course, when I got my new job in Japan, everything was already lined up, and it was a very smooth transition, and they haven't missed a single beat.
Good. That's great. Amy, anything else?
Oh, the one final one that I can correlate to our content for this session would be, what if you have no leaders in place, just a lot of interested parents and no firm structure?
Mark, do you want to take a first cut at that? That's a great question.
Well, I can't think of the exact phrase, but I think it goes something like, Rome wasn't built in a day. Is that right?
Yep, that's good.
So you just keep working at it, and you're never going to get it all right, ever. There's too many dynamics of scouting. But let's remember one thing: this is fun. And if we can enjoy our time while we're doing it, other things will come together. People will step up. Rely on your charter organization. You know, if you simply don't have the leadership that's needed, go back to your charter organization and ask for help. But just keep working at it. Keep focused, and it will work out in the end.
That's great. I just had one last thought, and that is, I read a poem years ago that goes, when any man holds twixt hand and chin a violin of mine, they will be glad Stradivari lived. In fact, I'm going to click this onto this one so you can see Antonio Stradivari made violins and made them of the best. The masters only know whose work is good, and they will choose mine. For while God gives them skill, I give them violins to play upon. God choosing me to help him. For God could not make Antonio Stradivari violins without Antonio. I love that. And you know, as weak as we are God's hands, and we're here to be able to help and to lift and to strengthen. And you know, I see these signs up and down the freeways on billboards. To be a foster parent, you don't have to be perfect. Well, to be a scoutmaster, you don't have to be perfect. And you know, when I was first called as a scoutmaster, I thought I was doing okay, you know, and then I went to basic training, and I realized, number one, I needed a lawn chair, but number two, then I went to wood badge, and I realized that there was so much more that I could do, and we just learn a little bit at a time. And I wish I would have been smarter as a scoutmaster, but you know, I still love my boys that were in that scouting troop, and I still communicate with one. One called me the other day, and I said, "Pete, how are you?" He was the first one to get the Eagle Award in our troop, and he says, "Actually, I'm just recovering from COVID-19." And we still keep in touch with these great boys, and we have young men and young women to be able to touch, and scouting will do it in a marvelous way. I don't know of a youth serving program anywhere that provides more rounded qualifications for our young people and helps prepare them better for the challenges ahead than scouting does. And when we take scouting and put it with this wonderful program that the church has in its children and youth program, it becomes so powerful. Because when you think about it, you know, what youth, 14, 12, 14-year-old young man or young woman is going to say as part of their goals, I'm going to learn CPR, or I'm going to learn first aid, or I'm going to learn money management or time management. You know, it's like Elder Hammond used to sing this wonderful song, "How will they know unless we teach them so?" And scouting, just by the mapping that Amy and Trevor showed us earlier, helps us to be able to open the vision of these young people so that they can go, oh, that's what this program is for children and youth. And they're working with their scouting program and finding also that it can work to help them fulfill their goals in the church. So we are grateful for all that you do. You are the Antonios who make a difference in the lives of our youth. So thank you very much for what you're doing.